And we are back for prepping for winter with part 3 of the Forsaken chapter. In parts 1 and 2, we found Aeron has been captured by Euron and has been playing the role of Bran, Dany, and Jesus opposite Euron's Bloodraven, Undying, and Satan. Euron has sent Aeron a dream stating there is no god or afterlife, and Euron wants Aeron to worship him instead. Now let's continue. The King's Moot was the last thing Damphair remembered clearly. As the captains lifted Euron onto their shoulders to hail him as their king, the priest had slipped off to find their brother Victarion. "Euron's blasphemies will bring down the drowned god's wrath upon us all," he warned. But Victarion insisted stubbornly that the god had raised their brother up, and that God must cast him down. So Aeron takes us back to just after the King's Moot to a conversation he has with Victarion. This is an interesting little scene, as this scene actually also appears in the Reaver chapter from Victarion's point of view, although Aeron's interpretation of events definitely demonstrates that he's off a bit in the head. So this is the missing conversation. Essentially, after Aeron mentions the wrath of the drowned god, Aeron tells Victarion that the two of them should act together because they are Balon's blood. Victarion then shoots down Aeron's argument since Euron is also of Balon's blood. Victarion then faults Aeron since it was his King's Moot that made Euron king, and Aeron himself put the crown on Euron's head. Aeron then says that he'll take Euron's crown away if Victarion rises up to stop Euron. Victarion passes on that, likely because he doesn't want to be a kinslayer, and says that the drowned god brought Euron up, so let the drowned god bring him down. Aeron then becomes furious and says that sorcery and drunken talk of dragons rose Euron up, and not the drowned god. In this conversation, Victarion is essentially blaming Aeron for the King's Moot and pointing out that Aeron's logic is pretty piss poor. But Aeron seems to be selectively forgetting all of this. He lies to himself much in the same way he lies to himself over the death of Yuri. Yuri's death is Aeron's fault, but Aeron is refusing to take the blame for his actions and pins it all on the Maesters. The same seems to be true of the King's Moot. Somehow in Aeron's head, it's not his fault for failing to accept the kingship, or calling the King's Moot, or placing too much faith in Victarion, or ignoring the fact that Euron is the elder brother, or for ignoring Victarion's blind loyalty to Euron, or for underestimating support for Asha, or for actually crowning Euron, or for relying on the concept of a drowned god to save them. No, Aeron is blameless in his own mind. It was all sorcery and drunkenness and Victarion's stubbornness. Anything contradicting his ideas are simply ignored. He will not act, the priest had realized then. It must be me. The King's Moot had chosen Euron Crowseye, but the King's Moot was made of men, and men were weak and foolish things, too easily swayed by gold and lies. I summoned them here, to Nagus Bones in the Grey King's Hall. I called them all together to choose a righteous king. But in their drunken folly they have sinned. It was for him to undo what they had done. The captains and the kings raised Euron up, but the common folk shall tear him down, he promised Victarion. I shall go to Great Wick, to Harlaw, to Orkmont, to Pike itself. Every town and village shall my words be heard. No godless man may sit the Seastone chair. Now here you can see how much effort Aeron puts into creating his own reality. Aeron says he called the King's Moot to choose a so-called righteous king, but he just dismissed Victarion as stubborn and impotent. Nothing is Aeron's fault in his mind, it was everyone else's drunken folly for not choosing the right person, even though Aeron doesn't think he's the right person anymore. Of course, to be fair to the Ironborn, back in the Prophet chapter, they were trying to choose a so-called righteous man to be their leader. They were trying to crown Aeron, and he refused. Aeron clearly had popular appeal and an influential voice, which is why the lords sought him out. But Aeron passes up the kingship for no good reason, really, and so the people there wanted him to be king-maker and choose either Victarion or Asha. But he passes on this as well. Only after the King's Moot does Aeron essentially begin to come around to what people wanted in the first place, for him to be a leader, for him to either be king or kingmaker. But as we will see, he kind of goes back on that as well. And Aeron once again speaks his mantra that no godless man may sit the Seastone chair, which again reminds us of Theon. At departing from his brother, he sought solace in the sea. A few of his drowned men made to follow him, but Aeron sent them off with a few sharp words. He wanted no company but God. Down where the longships had been beached, along the stony strand, he found a black salt wave surging and foaming white, where they broke upon a snarled rock, half buried in the sand. The water had been icy cold as he waded in, yet Aeron did not flinch from his god's caress. Waves smashed against his chest, one after another, staggering him, but he pushed on, deeper and deeper, until the waters were breaking over his head. The taste of salt upon his lips was sweeter than any wine. So interestingly, Aeron sends off his drowned men so he can be alone. I do wonder if one of his men is a traitor and tipped off Euron to where Aeron was going and what he was planning. We know it probably wasn't Old Grey Gull or Blind Baron Blacktide, as they were later tortured, but anyone else is suspect. Tarl the Thrice Drowned is equally important to Old Grey Gull and Blind Baron, so it's suspicious that he wasn't tortured when the other two were. Aeron is actually taking a dip in the very same bay where all the Ironborn ships are besides Asha's. So all of this is happening before Victarion closes off the bay with the Iron Fleet and Baelor Blacktide attempts to escape aboard his Night Flyer. Night Flyer is, by the way, named after yet another George R. R. Martin story that has to do with telepathy and disembodied and blended consciousness. Now, when Aeron enters the water, the language used is strikingly similar to when Aeron came up with the idea for the Kingsmoot. Icy cold water, waves smashing against his chest, waves breaking above his head, God's caress, the taste of salt. It's mostly the same. The one line that's different here is that salt water was sweeter than any wine. This is a peculiar line as there is nothing sweet about the ocean. Salt water, by definition, is salty. Yes, there's the concept of something being metaphorically sweet, but this is a strikingly odd line. And as it happens, Euron said something very similar earlier. He said that the wine of the warlocks was sweeter than salt water. Euron said something that was very obviously apparent. Of course wine is sweeter than salt water. Almost everything is sweeter than salt water because salt water isn't sweet. And conversely, Aeron thinks something ridiculous, that salt water would be sweeter than wine. Of course, this is a perfect metaphor for the two men's fates. To Euron, it's obviously apparent there is no drowned god, but to Aeron, the drowned god is real. Now, what isn't quite clear is if Euron knew Aeron's thoughts and then later made a comment about salt water and wine, or if Aeron took Euron's comments about salt water and wine and retroactively put it into his memory in the bay. Because the text has jumbled around the chronology, it's really tough to determine. Mingled with the distant roar of song and celebration coming from the beach, he'd heard the faint creak of longships settling on the strand. He heard the keening of the wind, and now whines. He heard the pounding of the waves, the hammer of his god calling him to battle. And there and then, the drowned god had come to him once more, his voice welling up from the depths of the sea. Now, one big mystery out there is who spoke to Aeron back in the Prophet chapter to suggest the Kingsmoot. Aeron went out into the sea and came back with an idea. Was it actually the drowned god? Was it Euron? Was it someone else? Or was it simply Aeron's own delusion? I will say that the Kingsmoot played well into Euron's hand, and he seemed to be prepared for the Kingsmoot with a Valyrian horn. That said, Aeron's return to the water equates the two events and equates the speakers. Here in this Forsaken chapter, Aeron says the drowned god has come to him once more. But Euron is busy celebrating over on the beach, so it doesn't actually seem to be him. Of course, it could be that the two messages from the drowned god are actually from two different people. Whatever the case, we will soon find out the identity of the second speaker. Aeron, my good and faithful servant, you must tell the Ironborn that the Crow's Eye is no true king, that the Sea Stone chair by rights belongs to... Not Victarion. Victarion had offered himself to the captains and kings, but they had spurned him. So the drowned god speaks to Aeron in all of his glory, and, at least in this instance, it becomes quite apparent who the drowned god really is. It's Aeron. He's delusionally talking to himself. The drowned god stops and hesitates because Aeron cannot decide who the rightful king should be. And so now this calls into question who told Aeron to call the Kingsmoot. On the one hand, as I said before, the Kingsmoot very much played into Euron's hand, and he was prepared for it. Additionally, Aeron weirdly didn't dream of Yuri or the Rusted Hinge that night, when he dreams of Yuri and the Hinge every night. And Euron already seems to be in Aeron's head a bit, knowing about the dreams of Yuri and Aeron's visions after the comet, and perhaps even the sweetness of saltwater. On the other hand, Aeron is so clearly the drowned god here that it stands to reason that he's the drowned god every time. Additionally, calling a Kingsmoot and passing up responsibility, and perhaps passing up conflict with Euron, is definitely a cowardly Aeron type of thing to do. It's a really tough call, but I lean towards Aeron being the drowned god both times. Not Asha. In his heart, Aeron had always loved Asha best of all his brother's children. The drowned god had blessed her with a warrior spirit and the wisdom of a king, but he had cursed her with a woman's body too. No woman had ever ruled the Iron Islands. She should never have made a claim. She should have spoken for Victarion, added her strength to his. So we find out that Aeron actually has a deep respect, admiration, and love for Asha. And from the Prophet chapter, we also know that Balon wanted Asha to succeed him. It's quite clear Asha would have had Aeron's complete and utter support if she were a man. We aren't quite certain where exactly Aeron got his deep hatred of women from. At the moment, we have to assume it's from his religious extremism, as it goes well beyond the sexism of any of the other Ironborn. But of course, Aeron being a bit nuts, we will see his views rapidly change. It was not too late, Aeron had decided as he shivered in the sea. If Victarion took Asha for his wife, they could yet rule together, king and queen. In ancient days, each isle had its salt king and its rock king. Let the old way return. So what Aeron is talking about here is that before the Iron Isles were unified, each island had two kings who co-ruled, one having dominion over land, the Rock King, and the other having dominion over the sea, the Salt King. Of course, we have no stories of female rulers, but this goes to show how much Aeron is willing to twist things in his head until it ends with the result he wants. Co-ruling is suddenly the old way and all of a sudden more important than sexism. Of course, one could easily argue that dissolving the unity of the Iron Isles is the old way, but there is no logic to an extremist's way of thinking. They will twist anything to fit their preconceived notion. Euron cannot rule, and that's all Aeron really cares about. Now, this genius revelation of Aeron's is actually kind of funny, as Victarion has already rejected it in the Iron Captain chapter. Asha proposes shared rule, and Victarion thinks she's talking about marriage and turns her down. And then Asha compromises and proposes that she just be hand to his kingship, and he rejects that too. Aeron's great revelation was ultimately never going to work. Aeron Damphair had struggled back to shore, full of fierce resolve. He would bring down Euron, not with sword or axe, but with the power of his faith. Padding lightly across the stones, his hair plastered back and dank across his brow and cheeks, he stopped for a moment to push it back out of his eyes. Now here Aeron is patting himself on the back for his courage and his resolve, which is actually rather funny. Back in the Reaver chapter, and a bit here, he had rejected Victarion because he would not act. It must be me, he says, and vows a popular rebellion. But he has actually backtracked quite a bit. His new idea is for co-rule of Asha and Victarion, placing the job to resist Euron back on them. Although Aeron talks big, he is ultimately a coward and scared to death of Euron. He didn't take the kingship despite having support. He rejected the role of kingmaker despite having support. And now he's walking back from his promise to be a revolutionary. Although Aeron repeatedly says that the cowardly weak boy is dead, Craven Aeron is definitely alive and well. And all of this fits with Aeron being a parallel of Jonah. Jonah was too scared to be a prophet for God. And that's why he was punished and thrown into the belly of the beast. And that was where they took him. The mutes who had been watching him, waiting for him, stalking him through strand and spray. A hand clapped down across his mouth, and something hard cracked against the back of his skull. The next time he had opened his eyes, the Damphair found himself fettered in the darkness. So the mutes were stalking Aeron as he went down to talk to the drowned god. That is, talk to himself. And they successfully capture him and imprison him on the Silence. Now the reason I suspect that there was a traitor among the drowned men is that Euron's mutes very quickly seek Aeron out, and later Euron says that he didn't want Aeron speaking out against him. This is something Aeron really only tells Victarion and whatever drowned men may have been near them. Of course, it's also quite possible that Euron simply guessed that Aeron would want to speak out against him. Then came the fever and the taste of blood in his mouth as he twisted in the chains, deep in the bowels of silence. A weaker man might have wept, but Aeron Damphair prayed. Waking, sleeping, even in his fever dreams, he prayed. My God is testing me. I must be strong. I must be true. So Aeron awakens from his dream with the taste of blood in his mouth. Now this is a pretty common occurrence among the Stark children after their wolf dreams. And this brings us back to our comparison of Aeron and Bran. That said, there are others who awaken with the taste of blood in their mouth as well. Tyrion, for example, after almost drowning in the Rhoyne, awakens with the taste of blood and rust in his mouth. Now perhaps Aeron and Tyrion just have wounds in their mouths, but I should also mention that psychological stress can cause people to taste blood or metal. People that suffer from seizures can also wake up with the taste of metal or blood in their mouth. So it may be that all of that tasting of blood that Bran and the others have after waking up is not actually from the direwolf's kill, but from mental stress. Now our author keeps jumping around in the chronology, which is confusing, but it seems that Aeron vows to be strong and resilient when he first arrived on the Silence. This is contrasted with Aeron's lowest point, which comes next, the arrival of Folia flowers. Once, in the dungeon before this one, a woman brought us food in place of Euron's mute. A young thing, buxom and pretty, she dressed in the finery of a Greenland lady. In the lantern light, she was the loveliest thing Aeron had ever seen.
"Woman," he said, "I am a man of God. I command you, set me free."
"Oh, I couldn't do that," she said. "I have food for you, porridge and honey." She sat beside him on a stool and spooned it into his mouth for him. Now Aeron has been beaten, bound, stripped naked, kept in darkness, starved, fed rotten food, given psychotropic drugs, and tortured with salt water. However, it's his conversation with Folia Flowers that drives Aeron to finally wanting death. Folia is beautiful, dressed sexily, and feeds Aeron the first real food he's had in weeks, honey and porridge. And this is perhaps a callback to Leaf presenting Bran a porridge of acorn paste. Now I imagine on the one hand, Folia represents temptation. Euron could give Aeron these pleasures all the time if he submitted. But on the other hand, Folia must also remind Aeron of his life as a drunkard and a womanizer, a lifestyle he took on in an attempt to forget about how he killed Yuri. And here we might be touching on why Aeron hates women so much. Women may remind Aeron of his time as a womanizer, which reminds him of Yuri.
"What is this place?"
he asked between spoonfuls. "My Lord Father's castle on Oakenshield, the Shield Islands, 1,000 leagues from home."
"And who are you, child?"
"Folia Flowers, Lord Hewitt's natural daughter. I am to be King Euron's salt wife. You and I will be kin then." So Aeron finds out where he is. Oakenshield, 1,000 leagues from home, which must be incredibly disheartening for him. He also finds out that his visitor is Folia Flowers, Humphrey Hewitt's natural daughter. Now I do have to say that Folia Flowers is an astoundingly weird character. This is a girl who apparently hated her family so much for making her serve them that she aligned with Euron. She then thought having them serve the Ironborn naked was funny, and is apparently okay with the fact that at least one of her half-sisters was raped. And yet she shows respect for her father by calling him Lord. I should actually mention that her father is no longer Lord of Oakenshield, or even a lord at all. Newt the Barber is Lord of Oakenshield. Incidentally, the Tyrells report that Humphrey Hewitt died. So either the Tyrells are lying or they got some bad information. Aeron Damphair raised his eyes to hers. His scabbed lips were crusted with wet porridge.
"Woman,"
his chains clinked when he moved. "Run.
He will hurt you. He will kill you."
She laughed. "Silly, he won't. I'm his love, his lady. He gives me gifts. So many gifts. Silks and furs and jewels. Rags and rocks, he calls them." So once again we are struck with how odd Folia is. It would take an inhuman amount of naivety to trust Euron Greyjoy. Folia has observed the invasion of her home and the likely death of many people around her. She has seen the torture of her family, and at least one of her half-sisters has been raped. And Aeron, who is sitting right in front of her, is evidence of Euron's cruelty. What human being would act the way Folia acts? Now perhaps Folia is simply a cruel person from years and years of mistreatment. Fine, but if she were so cruel, would she really be so trusting? Something is off about Folia. Perhaps she's acting, or perhaps she's being coerced, or perhaps she's being controlled. But something is not right. The Crow's Eye put no value in such things. That was one of the things that drew men to his service. Most captains kept the lion's share of their plunder, but Euron took almost nothing for himself. "He gives me any gown I want," the girl was prattling happily. "My sisters used to make me wait on them at table, but Euron made them serve the whole hall naked. Why should he do that except for love of me? Now Aeron makes a statement about why Euron's men are loyal, that they're in it for the money. But are they? Euron's crew are tongueless mutes. Who on earth would accept that lifestyle for slightly more money? Euron's share, divided amongst a crew, wouldn't be that much more plunder per person. I question Euron's crew's materialism, just as I question Folia's. Would she really abandon her family for some silks, furs, and jewels? Maybe, but I hardly believe that such a backstabbing gold digger would be simultaneously gabbing on about love, especially to a naked, tortured man covered in shit and vomit. It all doesn't make much sense. Folia herself says that Euron doesn't value the gifts that he gives her, thus they are meaningless as expressions of affection. And who in her right mind would mistake the cruel shaming of her family and the rape of her half-sister as an expression of love? She put her hand on her belly and smoothed down the fabric of her gown. I'm going to give him sons. So many sons.
He has sons.
Baseborn boys and mongrels, Euron says. My sons will come before them, he has sworn by your own drowned god. Aeron would have wept for her. Tears of blood, he thought. And the oddness continues. Folia herself is a bastard and presumably a follower of the Seven. Why would she speak despairingly of bastards' rights? And why would she dismiss them when Westerosi are normally quite worried about bastard claims? After all, she herself betrayed her family because she felt entitled to things. Wouldn't she expect the same from Euron's bastards? And why would she care about a promise to the drowned god, a god she's not even familiar with? At some point, it becomes too much. No one could possibly be as naive, stupid, and illogical as Folia Flowers. But let's step back a moment and remember that Euron sent this messenger to Aeron intentionally. She has a purpose. And let's also remember what's going on with Euron on Oakenshield. In the Reaver chapter, we see his men are actually losing faith with him. They are beginning to question his authority and his decisions. Euron isn't attacking Oldtown because he wants to. He's attacking it because Red Ralph Stonehouse, a Victarion follower, suggested it, and everyone else jumped on that train. As it turns out, Euron is not a master manipulator, or at least not without his horn. Upstairs, he is barely holding on to control, and yet Folia is down here convincing Aeron that Euron can seduce anyone with money and lies. We actually have no reason to believe anything Folia says. It's quite clear that she's only down here to demoralize Aeron.
You must bear a message to my brother. Not Euron, but Victarion, Lord Captain of the Iron Fleet. Do you know the man I mean?
Folia sat back from him. Yes, she said, but I couldn't bring him any message. He's gone.
Gone?
That was the cruelest blow of all.
Gone where?
East, she said, with all his ships. He's to bring the Dragon Queen to Westeros. I'm to be Euron's salt wife. But he must have a rock wife, too, a queen to rule all Westeros at his side. They say she's the most beautiful woman in the world, and she has dragons. The two of us will be closest sisters. And now the big blow. Victarion is gone. As I've been saying, Aeron is a coward and is continually looking to avoid facing Euron himself. Victarion was his only hope to stand up to Euron. Without Victarion, Aeron is all alone. And again, Folia acts ridiculous and is for some reason happy about a second, obviously much more important queen coming to join them. Now yes, under Ironborn law, a salt wife's children can inherit, but it's hard to believe that anyone would be dumb enough to believe that in practice, their kids would come before Daenerys's. It's also curious how much of Folia's language comes from Euron. Baseborn boys and mongrels, the most beautiful woman in the world, rags and rocks. It's also interesting that for the most part, Folia only brings up information from the Reaver chapter, formerly being a servant, being given gowns, the humiliation of her family, Victarion's quest east. But most importantly, it's of note that everything that she mentions to Aeron demoralizes him. She presents a narrative that the world is easily seduced by Euron, that blasphemy against the drowned god will continue, and that Victarion is gone. It's a message to Aeron that everything is hopeless, which is actually far from the truth. Now I will say it seems quite likely that Folia is either being coerced or controlled by Euron, or perhaps is Euron in disguise. It's striking that Folia uses Euron's words and does not provide any information that Euron does not already know. Aeron Damphair hardly heard her. Victarion is gone. Half a world away or dead. Surely the drowned god was testing him. This was a lesson for him. Put not your trust in men. Only my faith can save me now. That night, When the tide came rushing back into the prison cell, he prayed that it might rise all night, enough to end his torment. I have been your true and leal servant, he prayed, twisting in his chains. Now snatch me from my brother's hand, and take me down beneath the waves, to be seated at your side. And so now we find that the words of Folia have finally brought Aeron to wanting death. To Aeron, Euron appears unstoppable, and without Victarion, there is no one to save him. And this is a good place to stop. We will continue on with the Forsaken in Part 4.